I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
But why do you care about stupid people? Stupid people, these people have power.
We've all heard the story, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But what if I told you that this isn't just a saying, it's a carefully engineered reality?
For roughly 30 years, a little over that, for the majority of the population, real wages have pretty close to stagnated. Meanwhile, there has, of course, been wealth created. It's gone into very few hands, mostly into a fraction of the top 1%.
Today we are diving into Noam Chomsky's chapter, Prosperous Few and the Restless Many, from his book How the World Works. This chapter doesn't just reveal the widening gap between the wealthy and everyone else. It exposes the system that was designed to make it happen. By the end of this video, you'll have the knowledge to see the economic world in a new light, and that's a powerful place to start. Let's rewind to the early 1970s. Picture this. The world's economic stability is anchored by the Bretton Woods system, a post-World War II agreement that keeps currencies tied to the US dollar, which itself is backed by gold. This system made global trade predictable and controlled the flow of capital across borders. But then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon decides to blow it all up.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
He takes the US off the gold standard, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. Why? Because the US could no longer dominate the global economy the way it used to. The world was changing. Japan and Europe were rising as economic powers, with larger and larger dollar reserves. If they demanded to exchange their dollars for gold, the US would go bankrupt. So the US had to adapt. This single act triggered a seismic shift in the global economy.
This period of globalization, what's called globalization, past 25 years, was really initiated by the breakdown of capital controls. The Bretton Woods system, the preceding 25 years, was based on control of capital movement. The countries could control capital movements, and currencies were regulated relative to one another within a pretty narrow band.
Currencies were suddenly free-floating, markets became hyper-competitive, and capital began to flow across borders like never before. On the surface, it might have looked like progress, but beneath the surface, something darker was taking shape. Now, while all this was happening globally, something else was going on at home in the United States. Given a combination of high inflation and economic stagnation, corporate profits were starting to feel the squeeze, and the response was brutal. Companies and the wealthy elite launched an all-out assault on social welfare programs, social security, healthcare, education, programs that have been the backbone of the middle and lower class.
When this system was dismantled, 70s through state initiative, United States, Canada, Britain, and others, that led to a major attack on popular democracy.
This wasn't just about balancing budgets or cutting taxes. It was about shifting resources, taking them from the public and handing them to the private sector. It was a deliberate, calculated move to make the rich richer at the expense of everyone else. And this was just the beginning.
There's been a major attack on democracy in the last 20-25 years. That's in fact a large part of what's called globalization. What's called globalization is kind of a cover for the shifting of decision-making away from instruments of popular sovereignty, like governments in the more democratic countries. In the more democratic countries, that means the public to some extent at least. Shifting of decisions away from them into private tyrannies. They're private tyrannies.
Here's where it gets really interesting or really terrifying depending on how you look at it. With the Bretton Woods system gone, capital, meaning money, investments and corporate power, was suddenly unchained. It could move freely anywhere, anytime with no restrictions. This was a dream come true for corporations. They could now shift production to places where labor was cheap and regulations were almost non-existent. General Motors announced the closure of 24 factories in North America to reopen them in East Germany. That's where General Motors could pay only 40% of wages in Western Europe. But what did this mean for the average worker? It meant lower wages, less job security, and a race to the bottom in terms of working conditions. Corporations didn't have to worry about paying fair wages or adhering to safety standards. They could always move to another country if workers demanded too much.
In the United States, power is overwhelmingly and increasingly in recent years in the hands of a very narrow sector of corporate wealth, private wealth, and power. And they have counterparts elsewhere who agree with them, who interact with them largely. And that's another dimension in who rules the world.
And now you might be thinking, how long can this go on? As the rich consolidate their power, the gap between them and the rest of society keeps widening.
62 individuals hold half the world's wealth, and there are many very ugly consequences to this.
And with this growing inequality comes something that's harder to ignore: unrest. This unrest is global. It's not just happening in one place or among one group of people. From the streets of American cities to towns and villages around the globe, the restless many are pushing back. They're demanding a system that works for everyone, and not just the prosperous few. So where do we go from here? The challenges Chomsky outlines are immense, but he doesn't leave us without a sense of direction. We get the impression that the solution lies not just in rebuilding social welfare programs, but in something far more fundamental: recognizing that the concentration of wealth and decision-making in the hands of a few is incompatible with true democracy.
But why do you think more participation by the public, more democracy is the answer?
Because, well, more democracy is a value in itself. So quite apart, because democracy is a value. It doesn't have to be defended any more than freedom has to be defended. It's just, it's an essential feature of human nature that people should be free, they should be able to participate, they should be uncoerced, and so on.
The path forward involves challenging the dominance of corporations, demanding greater transparency, accountability, and actively participating in political process to create a system that prioritizes the common good over private profit. It's about recognizing that the economy isn't a force of nature, but something we can and must shape.
I think that that's the only hope that I can see, that other values will come to the fore. I mean, if the society is based on control by private wealth, it will reflect the values that it in fact does reflect, the value that the only real human property is the desire is greed and the desire to maximize personal gain at the expense of others.
Chomsky's message is clear: the power to create a more just and equitable world lies not with the prosperous few, but with the restless many.
Force is on the side of the governed. Those who are governed have the force if they are willing to and eager to and recognize the possibility to exercise it. Sometimes they do. That's a major force in who rules the world.